Before commencing this presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the peoples of the Darug, Tharawal, Eora and Wiradjuri nations. I would also like to acknowledge that the teaching and learning currently delivered across our Western Sydney University campuses is a continuation of the teaching and learning that has occurred on these lands for tens of thousands of years. I'd like to start this presentation by thanking the organisers for their kind invitation and for allowing me to join, virtually, given the circumstances we find ourselves in. I'm disappointed not to be with you in person, but happy to be involved in some small way. Thanks especially to Sigurd for the invitation. The second thing I'd like to do is outline what I mean by the word heritage. It is a word I use to refer to those places, objects, and memories that have acquired shared meaning to the extent that people alter their behaviour in relation to them. Through this framing, heritage becomes something that is intimately connected with how we feel about ourselves, as individuals and collectives, both now and into our futures. Given this definition, it should be quite easy to imagine how heritage studies could be enhanced by an academic engagement with affective and atmospheric resonances. Yet curiously, it is a field that has been relatively slow to grasp the opportunities posed by such thinking. Rather, its strong canon of representational literature, in vogue since the 1980s, has continued to dominate, along with an emphasis on the textual and visual. A turn to more than representational thinking, then, poses a significant challenge. My interest in more than representational thinking commenced while I was collaborating with Professor Steve Watson, who sadly passed away in 2016. Our joint ambition was to bring existing approaches to heritage into conversation with less conventional methodologies in order to create a more open empiricism in our field. Elsewhere, we have referred to the outcomes of this ambition as a new empirical motility, one that provides opportunities not only for broadening the range of methods employed in heritage research, but for expanding the scope of the field in and of itself, by prompting us as researchers to ask different questions. Bringing to fruition this new empirical focus exercised a great deal of shared thinking between Steve and I. For us, the issue was clear. While conventional research had allowed us to understand when and why people encountered places of heritage, their engagements were often confined to representational dynamics. The questions that remained unanswered were essentially those concerned with the way that people experienced the world. In other words, whilst we had asked people who they were, what they were doing, and consulted their attitudes, values, and beliefs, how they felt about and responded to the things they were encountering, and how those feelings interacted with their surrounding and what they and others had brought into it, seemed to sit beyond the remit of conventional research. As such, Steve and I looked to more than representational thinking and the related Deleuzian interpretation of affect as a way to challenge the field's preoccupation with the representation of representational things. Affect in this pocket of the literature refers to the constellation of responses, meanings, and intensities that gather around embodied states, as well as its infectious and less than fully conscious processes of affecting and being affected. As a theoretical underpinning, it enabled us to attune not only to individual encounters with heritage, but to shared ones between groups, communities, social classes, and societies. It required us to accept that no exploration of heritage can close off the social and political that makes it a significant cultural form, whilst at the same time insisting that only taking on board that established view would be detrimental to any attempt to fully understand it. In this presentation, then, my intention is to set out some theoretical footings for understanding our affective encounters with heritage, before turning to the results of research with visitors to the Sovereign Hill Outdoor Museum in Victoria, Australia. Given its remit for storying past lives, I use the example of Sovereign Hill to home in on the lively, everyday practices of heritage visiting, using visitors' attempts to understand and respond to contemporary social life as a way to think about the relevance, or afterlives, of the past and the present. To illustrate, I will draw on data gathered in the form of interviews, go-alongs, and a process of photo elicitation, which I use to identify cognitive and affective responses to the history and heritage of gold mining on display at Sovereign Hill. While remaining interested in traditional notions of the semiotic, I want to expand its remit to include immediacy, performance, engagement, feelings, and encounters. This means, in addition to reflecting on the influence of social, cultural, and institutional processes of meaning-making, I also want to take account of the momentary interruptions or transformations that bring wider histories into relation with affective and subjective feeling. Such encounters within spaces of heritage and museums are infinitely varied. They include the surfaces we touch, the things we see and read, our reactions to objects and interpretive interventions, the smells, the crowds, the weather, and the improvised sounds made by others as we move through shared spaces and exhibitions. Such encounters trigger positive and negative effects, all of which are expressed in some way, as fear, anger, pleasure, joy, boredom, and so on. A more than representational style of thinking, or an as well as approach, attempts to halt what Wetherell et al. Describe as the sleight of hand, through which effect becomes some kind of other to semiosis. In other words, it trains its line of sight on both the representational and the lived. At a base level, this style of thinking emerges out of a broader predisposition towards the processual emergence of life, and those concomitant turns towards practice and performativity. It is, as Barron writes, about enlivening and revealing excessive, transient, and more than human potentialities, by emphasising dynamic, embodied, and relational practices. Key to the more than representational literature is the notion of affect, which Anderson defines as the capacity which a body has to be affected through an affection, and to affect as a result of modifications. While I share a sense of uneasiness with some aspects of this, I accept that it emerges from what Wetherell et al. Refer to as the dynamic blossoming patchworks of neural firing, cognitive action, narratives, and intersubjective negotiation. It is thus a concept that is usefully examined in concert with the idea of force, whether that be social, political, economic, personal, or a combination of all of them. This dual interest in force and affect pushes us to unpack not only what heritage places, interpretations, and experiences mean, but also what they might do, opening up questions about what a heritage object or place means and how those meanings might change over time, what feelings they invoke, and which emotions stick as people interact with them. Of course, as Wetherell et al. Note, it is important to acknowledge the intertwining of past practices, identities, positions, material social locations, forms of privilege and disadvantage, and so on, which embed that effect and make it consequential. In other words, not everything is possible for everyone. The capacity to stick, to pull people and their memories into orbit, depends on the effective power of the residues of the past and how they are encountered, as well as feelings of safety, of personal constraints, and the significant issues of class, race, gender, and a raft of other structural disadvantages. Created in the summer of 1970, Sovereign Hill Outdoor Museum was an attempt by the Ballarat Historical Park Association to remember an industry that was no longer present: gold mining. The story of gold mining in the area began in 1851, when alluvial gold was found. With the discovery of one of the world's largest gold nuggets in 1858, the Welcome Nugget, pulled from the Red Hill mine and weighing almost 69 kilos, Ballarat quickly became known as the richest alluvial goldfield ever, and in time would yield over 600 tonnes of the stuff. Over the course of a decade, Ballarat was haphazardly transformed into the bustling town needed for the waves of arrivals intent on making their fortune. By the early 1860s, some 40,000 people were working in the area. While aspirations for finding alluvial gold had dwindled by the mid to late 1860s, the quest for gold-bearing quartz continued up until 1918, ending during the First World War. After that, gold mining was replaced by agriculture. But gold mining still held promise, both as something to be remembered and as an important driver of a different kind of economy. tourism. Keen to acknowledge that Ballarat had been founded on rich deposits of gold and an associated glorious past, the association resolved that Ballarat's leading role in the great Australian gold rushes would never be forgotten. Since its establishment, the museum has become an emblematic example of Australia's heritage, with no other heritage attraction in Australia operating on its scale. In terms of appeal, it entices not only those wishing to honour the region's gold mining past, but those interested in the labour movement and Australian history more broadly. It trades on strong themes of nostalgia and is packed with artefacts, streetscapes, costumed actors, stories, reconstructions, and performances that attempt to recover and represent the experiences of the goldfields. It is also attentive to themes of nationalism, particularly in its attempts to represent the early settlement of Australia. It was only a few decades after the closure of the mines that the blueprint for a heritage site was conceived. In the late 1960s, planning commenced for an open-air museum that would depict the region of Ballarat during the Gold Rush era, with a focus on the 10-year period between 1851 and 1861. In its creation, no buildings were constructed or recreated without the use of historical visual references, in a bid to ensure historical accuracy. What emerged is a tourist attraction that claims the attention of approximately 700,000 visitors per year, 26% of whom are international. As a museum, Sovereign Hill prides itself on fostering and engaging an interactive interpretation strategy in the creation of living history, for which it draws on a combination of duplication, reenactment, and activation. As Magelson points out, such museums do not merely represent the past, they make historical truth for the visitor. At Sovereign Hill, this merging of history, truth, and performance is achieved primarily through the application of a creative, theatrical, and costumed approach. During my time at Sovereign Hill, I gathered together the views of 70 visitors, built out of conversations varying in length from 5 to 40 minutes, during which I explored participants' affective discursive entanglements. With the help of a research assistant, I encountered people of different ages, genders, ethnicities, religions, occupations, economic classes, and nationalities. Clearly, this collection of people would engage with the museum in varied ways, feeling, acting, thinking, and curating their own experiential take on the history it represents, creatively, individually, and idiosyncratically. That said, many of the visitors we spoke to alluded to what I call emergent nostalgia, or a feeling of longing that emerged from the sounds, smells, and everything else with it, including the costumed reenactors who brought the site to life. Such visitors were attuned to the distinct fragrances of freshly made pies, gunpowder, horses, and the lingering scent of burning household fires, all of which had been smelt somewhere else before, prompting reflections on a different, often better past. Bennett suggests nostalgia is something shared, through which an unease with the present is soothed with reference to a cosy and partial history. At Sovereign Hill, this soothing occurred in response to a feeling of stepping back in time, as participant 7, quoted here, indicates. This quote points to a sense of being transported beyond or behind the time frame of now, adding up to a sort of affective projection that taps into a claim made some years ago that no space vanishes utterly, leaving no trace. At Sovereign Hill, such projections were not always about reminiscing about a better time, however. Some components of the site that seemed proximate to back then, such as the miners' cottages and descending into the Sovereign Quartz Mine and its dark, cold, damp corridors, were places in which visitors were pushed to imagine a more difficult time, prompted by a recall of the lack of safety and the disorientating effects of little lighting. The absence of both triggered feelings of gratitude for these visitors, who connected their own bodies imaginatively to the harshness of the life experienced by others. A familiarity with the relentlessness of flies and dust, and of an environment that would have been too hot in summer and freezing in winter, prompted for some an appreciation of what it must have been like for the miners, the women, and the Chinese living such harsh and tenuous lives. Sarah Ahmed points out that emotions cut across borders and categories of self and difference, revealing the workings of power and positionality within museological settings. At Sovereign Hill, such power seemed to emerge around that category of self associated with national belonging, or that of being Australian in this case, the prevalence of which presumably links to the site's role as defining settler heritage within the nation's repertoire. Many participants express themselves in such terms, as the current two quotes illustrate. In part, both quotes are a response to the narratives created by and at Sovereign Hill, and a palpable pride in its pioneering history. This sense of pride was actively engineered into the museum itself, which was explicitly designed to offer its audiences an exciting chapter in the history of Australia. It is unsurprising, therefore, to see that the weight of these narratives was felt and taken up by a range of visitors at particular moments during their visit. For some visitors, a category of self, defined around notions of Australianness, worked explicitly to subdue other categories, such as newcomers and other cultures, as the current quotes identify. Implicit here is a feeling of belonging, or perhaps more accurately, the policing of a feeling of belonging. Interestingly, this policing seemed to revolve in part around the intentionality of the Union Jack and the different affective and symbolic qualities it has come to embody. The same object was actualised in two very different ways, depending on its relations to each body and their histories and contexts. Participant 62, the second quote here, referenced a sense of Probyn's contagion of shame, which she argues works to expose any breaches in the border between self and other. Here, the vulnerability of that breach was swiftly policed and minimised with reference to a positive value judgment about where we are today. Whilst there was a sense of unease evident within the last quote, and a clear demarcation between self and other that the speaker was seeking to explain, these registers were replicated more explicitly in a conversation with a woman visiting the site for the first time, who remarked, "We've seriously lost it, because it's all about multiculturalism and all that sort of thing now, and we can't think about being Australian anymore. We've got to think about everybody else. It's quite annoying to me, actually, because when I went to school, we were actually just talking about Australian history and everything like that." While reminders of immigration and multiculturalism felt for some visitors like intrusions and uncomfortable presences, the same narratives for others prompted an openness to the possibilities of difference and a more inclusive framing of belonging. As such, the museum can be viewed as a changing constellation, triggering for some an ethical sensibility arising out of a palpable absence, the absence of others. In an effort to promote a simple, legible narrative at Sovereign Hill, there has inevitably emerged the portrayal of one dominant kind of life, that of the white male settler. Thus, the spaces in between the signs, actors, artefacts, and buildings that point towards that particular historical figure, a more troubling suite of questions about erasure gathers. For a number of visitors, such questions pierced through the museum's exhibitions and prompted them to search for historical evidence, material traces, and place stories and the vestiges of lives associated with others, the Chinese, women, and Indigenous peoples. This, for them, produced a very different museological space, one haunted by absence, by the dead and their memories, and out of which flowed lingering threads of loss. Such a haunting has the capacity to turn an absence into a pressure on the body, a physical presence that is felt and thereby affects, compelling some visitors, as the current quote illustrates, to imagine the situations and circumstances of others. These are a continuation of her thoughts. An empowered agent, this visitor actively engaged with an effective discursive practice that prompted her to lament the lack of feeling stirred by her visit. She notes a failure of the interpretive material to fully satisfy her interest, the type of interest, as Probyn points out, that's hard to come by unless it's deep within your habitus. As these extracts attest, the museum affords opportunities for critical thinking about the consequences of belonging and feelings of alienation and persecution, particularly in relation to Chinese miners. During the 1850s, male Chinese miners made up almost 1/4 of the population. Yet little is known about them in their own right, beyond that they were subjected to relentless persecution and acts of racism. As the layout of Sovereign Hill illustrates, the Chinese miners were marginalised spatially and were often located at the bottom of the mining camps, where runoff sewerage flowed freely. Visitors today get a sense of this at the Golden Point Chinese village, which consists of small, darkened tents, a herbalist shop, and a temple. On occasion, these more sanitized spaces are injected with signs of life in the form of audio recordings, which depict the thoughts of Chinese miners on everyday life, the English, the issue of tax, and their cramped living spaces. A key moment where resonations of the other are felt at Sovereign Hill occurred during the reenactments of an anti-immigration meeting performed in the Victoria Theatre. During such performances, costumed actors work hard to recreate feelings of discrimination and persecution in everyday mining life, using a script that revolves around the central character of Ballarat's Chinese protector, appointed by colonial authorities, William Henry Foster. The language used is drawn from historical sources and carries a sense of authenticity. During the course of a performance, I observed, some audience members left the theatre in alarm, while others looked unsettled and confused. It was a useful reminder that affect is not only a matter for the individual. Indeed, my own responses were in many ways mediated by the responses of those around me. This was a point in my fieldwork during which strong emotions palpably circulated. In that short moment, the weighted bodies of white miners lost a prominence and gave room, however momentarily, to the bodies and histories of Chinese miners. For me, and perhaps for everyone else in that theatre, my own ethnic and national identities felt disturbingly and shamefully exposed, and those feelings stuck as I exited the theatre. I burst into Sovereign Hill on a Monday morning in 2014. As I stood and got to grips with the scenes unfolding before me, I remember thinking about how I got into this area of research in the first place. Visits to places like Hiroshima and Auschwitz. I was also thinking about the intersections between past and present, and recalling Dennis Burns' insistence that heritage studies could and should do more to understand how past landscapes and objects conjure and mediate affect. My research in places like Sovereign Hill can contribute to such a debate by drawing attention to the cognitive, discursive, and interpretive arrangements within spaces of heritage. Over the course of a few seasons of fieldwork and hundreds of conversations with visitors to heritage sites, it has become clear to me that many visitors use the past, however it is evoked, in ways that are deeply and theoretically engaging. Everyday practices of visiting often prompt them to reflect upon and respond to a range of contemporary social and political debates within the context of the historical. In other words, heritage facilitates an engagement with the present, which is clearly informed by messages about the past retrieved on site. I started this presentation with a brief overview of more than representational thinking, which I argued produces insights about places of heritage that extend beyond their role as attractions by bringing to bear embodied meaning-making or embodied semiosis. I hinted at something of a deficit that exists in heritage research around understanding what actually happens in moments of encounter. And to remedy this, I advocated for a research style that seeks to access sensual, emotional, and reflexive embodied performances. In addition to acknowledging the vitality of such encounters, I also pointed to the importance of identity work. At Sovereign Hill, visitors sought to understand their own identities as visitors, Australians, and political beings within the spatial and historical contexts afforded by the museum, particularly in response to the absence or presence of markers of identity. I want to close by reiterating the need to place greater emphasis on the experiential and emotional experiences of visitors, or those fuller-bodied engagements that might lead us towards better understanding what places or objects of heritage mean and what feelings they invoke. Thank you for listening.